I'm David Martinez, 34, and I spent 7 years on death row for murders I didn't commit. The evidence was overwhelming: 3 bodies. My DNA at the scene, witnesses who swore they saw me there. Even my own lawyer seemed to doubt my innocence. I watched the calendar mark off days until my execution, feeling the weight of a justice system that had failed me completely. But 3 weeks before my scheduled death, a phone call changed everything. The 3 victims weren't dead, were very much alive. And their story of why they faked their own deaths would expose a conspiracy that reached deeper than I ever imagined. Sometimes the truth is stranger than any lie, and sometimes the real criminals are the ones you'd never suspect. Like and subscribe if you've ever been in a situation where everyone doubted your truth, but you knew deep down you were innocent. The night of March 15th, 2016, started like any other Tuesday. I was working late at my auto repair shop, wrestling with a stubborn transmission. The crime scene photos that would destroy my life showed a horrific scene at 1247 Maple Street. People supposedly murdered between 9 p.m. and midnight, but I wasn't there. I was covered in transmission fluid, fighting with a torque converter that wouldn't cooperate. Our security cameras had mysteriously malfunctioned that week. My only witness was Mrs. Rodriguez from the restaurant next door, who brought me leftover food around 10:30 p.m. By trial time, she'd moved to Mexico. The victims were strangers: Amanda Walsh, 28, an accountant; Michael Torres, 31, construction worker; Lisa Kim, 35, small business owner. Their names meant nothing then. They'd haunt me for 7 years. Everything changed at 6:47 a.m. On March 17th, Detective Ray Morrison kicked down my door while I drank morning coffee in my underwear. The splintering wood shocked me awake. "David Martinez, you're under arrest for the murders of Amanda Walsh, Michael Torres, and Lisa Kim," Morrison announced with absolute certainty. 4 officers stood behind him, hands on weapons like I was dangerous. "There's been a mistake," I stammered. "I don't know those people." But Morrison was reading my rights. Handcuffs clicked around my wrists, the sound of my life ending. Neighbors watched from windows as they led me away. Mrs. Santos pulled her daughter back, afraid I might contaminate her child. The evidence was overwhelming. My DNA on all 3 victims. A witness saw me fleeing around 11 p.m. Another claimed I'd asked about the victims' schedules weeks earlier. The prosecution painted me as a calculated killer who planned everything meticulously. None of it made sense. I'd never been to that duplex, never met those people, never asked about anyone's routine. But evidence doesn't lie, so everyone believed DNA results were unquestionable. Witness testimonies consistent. Physical evidence pointed directly at me. What haunted me wasn't the evidence itself, but how perfectly everything fit together. Someone had crafted an airtight case against me, leaving no room for doubt. Every piece complemented the others, creating a narrative so compelling, I began questioning my own memories. The crime scene photos were devastating. They showed violence that sickened seasoned detectives. Prosecutors argued the brutality indicated personal hatred. I must have known these victims intimately to kill them so savagely. But looking at those images, I felt only horror. The same any innocent person would feel. The photos showed blood spatter patterns, overturned furniture, signs of struggle. Expert witnesses explained how the killer must have moved through the apartment, how long each victim had suffered, how much planning the murders required. Every detail seemed to point to me. During those first days in jail, I replayed that Tuesday night obsessively. Working late, Mrs. Rodriguez's visit, going home around midnight, falling asleep watching television. A mundane evening that somehow became the foundation for 3 murder charges. I couldn't understand how my DNA ended up at a crime scene I'd never visited. I couldn't explain the witnesses who seemed so certain they'd seen me. The evidence was impossible to argue with, yet I knew it was wrong. Those crime scene photos would follow me through trial, appeals, and 7 years on, death row fabricated. Evidence so convincing it fooled everyone, including myself at times. The DNA evidence report became the prosecution's subpoena, 23-page document that sealed my fate. Dr. Amanda Foster held it up during testimony like sacred scripture. Every page containing proof that my genetic material was found on all 3 victims. Probability that this DNA belongs to anyone other than the defendant is less than 1 in 14 billion. Dr. Foster testified with scientific authority. To put that in perspective, there are only 8 billion people on Earth. My court-appointed attorney, James Whitfield, sat beside me taking notes, but I felt his doubt radiating like heat. During pretrial meetings, he repeatedly asked me to level with him about what really happened. When I insisted on innocence, he'd nod politely and discuss plea bargains. "David, they're seeking death," he said during one tense meeting. "The evidence is overwhelming. Life without parole would avoid execution." "I didn't kill anyone," I replied for the 100th time. "How can I plead guilty to something I didn't do?" Whitfield would sigh and shuffle papers, his body language screaming that he thought I was delusional. He went through the motions of defense, but his heart wasn't in it. During cross-examinations, his questions lacked the sharp edge of someone fighting for an innocent man's life. The witness testimonies devastated me. Maria Santos, a night shift nurse living across from the duplex, testified she saw me leaving the building around 11:15 p.m. She picked me out of a lineup without hesitation. "I'll never forget that face," she said, pointing at me. "He looked nervous. Kept checking over his shoulder as he walked to his car." The problem was, I didn't own the blue Honda Civic she described. I drove a red pickup truck, currently impounded as evidence. But her description matched a car stolen from a parking lot 12 miles away, found burned in a field 2 days after the murders. Jerome Mitchell, a convenience store clerk, claimed I'd asked about the victim's schedules 3 weeks before the murders. According to his testimony, I'd casually mentioned renting an apartment in their building and wanted to know about quiet tenants. He specifically asked about the white girl in 2A, the Hispanic guy in 2B, and the Asian woman in 3A, Mitchell testified. Said he wanted to make sure they weren't party animals. The descriptions matched Amanda Walsh, Michael Torres, and Lisa Kim perfectly. But I'd never entered that convenience store, never spoken to Jerome Mitchell, never inquired about anyone's living situation. Yet he seemed certain, confident in his recollection. Physical evidence was equally damning. A bloody fingerprint on the door frame matched mine. Fibers from my work clothes were found at the scene. My cell phone data allegedly showed I'd been in the area that night, though prosecutors couldn't explain why the phone was there while I was at the shop. The jury took less than 4 hours to reach their verdict. When the foreman stood and said guilty 3 times, once for each victim, something inside me shattered. The courtroom erupted in relief and satisfaction. Victims' families hugged and wept. Reporters scribbled furiously. My mother, who'd attended every day, collapsed in her seat. Miguel reached to comfort her, but I saw doubt in his eyes too. Even my brother wasn't entirely convinced of my innocence. Judge Patricia Hawkins scheduled sentencing for the following week. As bailiffs led me away in shackles, I glimpsed the victims' families. Their faces showed grief mixed with satisfaction for lost loved ones, satisfaction that justice had been served, but justice hadn't been served. An innocent man had just been convicted of 3 murders he didn't commit, and the real killers were probably watching news coverage, laughing at how perfectly their plan had worked. The DNA evidence report would follow me to death. Roa scientific document proving beyond doubt that I was a monster. But science, I would learn, could be manipulated like everything else. The prison-issued Bible became my lifeline in a place designed to strip away hope. Its worn pages belonged to the previous occupant of cell for 7B, Thomas Garrett, executed 6 months before my arrival. Someone had written, "Truth will set you free," in faded pencil inside the cover, and I clung to those words like a drowning man. Death row at Riverside Correctional was a concrete tomb housing society's worst monsters. Cells measured 6 by 9 feet smaller than most bathrooms. A narrow cot, metal toilet, and tiny writing desk comprised my entire world. The only window was a thin slit showing gray sky, never blue, never promising. The sounds nearly drove me insane. Constant clanging of metal doors, echoing footsteps on concrete, occasional screams from someone who'd finally snapped. But worst was the silence, heavy, oppressive quiet during long hours between meals, when there was nothing to do but think about mistakes that led you here. My neighbors were humanity's failures and society's nightmares. To my left was Carlos Mendez, who'd killed his wife and her lover in rage. To my right was William Billy Thompson, a serial killer who'd murdered 5 elderly women. These men shared my final years, and the irony wasn't lost that I was the only innocent one among us. Carlos was surprisingly philosophical. "I did what I did," he'd whisper through ventilation. "I ain't proud, but I ain't gonna lie either. But you, Martinez, you got that look of a man who don't belong here." Billy believed everyone on death row was innocent. "They always frame the little guy," he'd say with certainty. "The system needs scapegoats." Coming from a man who'd confessed to 5 murders in graphic detail, his conspiracy theories felt both ironic and oddly comforting. Guards fell into 2 categories: those who treated us like animals and those who still saw our humanity. Officer Janet Rodriguez belonged to the latter. After 15 years working death row, she'd developed intuitive sense about the men under her watch. "You're different," she told me. "After 6 months, most of these guys got darkness in their eyes. You got the look of someone who's lost, not evil." Officer Derek Williams was the opposite. He took pleasure reminding us daily that we were going to die. "Tick-tock, Martinez," he'd whisper passing my cell. Tick-tock, he'd count down days too. My execution, like a sadistic calendar. Satisfaction in his eyes when delivering news that another appeal was denied. The psychological toll was immeasurable. Knowing your exact death date creates unique torture. Unlike terminal patients who might hope for miracle cures, or soldiers facing possible death, I lived with absolute certainty that on March 15th, 2024, the state would kill me. I watched other men walk their final walk. Protocol was always the same: move to holding cell 3 days before execution. Final family visits, last meal, opportunity for final statement. Some went quietly, others fought and screamed. Thomas Rodriguez executed 2 years into my stay. spent final moments proclaiming innocence so passionately that even hardened guards looked uncomfortable. Sleep became elusive. Lights never went completely dark. Constant noise made rest nearly impossible. I'd lie on my narrow cot, staring at ceiling, running through that Tuesday night obsessively. Had I missed something? Was there a detail I'd forgotten that could prove innocence? My appeals failed one by one. Each rejection letter felt like another nail in my coffin. Whitfield was replaced by Rebecca Martinez, a dedicated public defender, specializing in death penalty cases. She believed in my innocence, which was blessing and curse. Her faith gave hope, but made each legal setback more devastating. The Bible's margins filled with my thoughts, prayers, desperate pleas for justice. I'd never been particularly religious before conviction, but facing death made believers of anyone. I prayed for truth to emerge, for real killers to be caught, for some miracle proving my innocence. Years passed in blur of failed appeals, denied petitions, growing despair. My execution date was postponed twice due to legal challenges, but each postponement felt more like delay than genuine reprieve. The prison phone log for February 23, 2024, would become the most important document in my case, a single entry recording the call that saved my life. At 2:47 p.m., an incoming call was logged from a blocked number. The caller requested to speak with someone about urgent information regarding inmate David Martinez. I was in my cell when Officer Rodriguez appeared at my door, face pale and confused. "Martinez, you need to come with me. There's been a phone call." In 7 years on death row, I'd never been summoned because of a phone call. Visits? Yes. Legal consultations? Certainly. But never a mysterious call that had the entire administrative staff buzzing with nervous energy. The walk to the administration office felt surreal. Other inmates pressed against cell doors, trying to glimpse what was happening. Word traveled, fast in prison, and everyone knew when something unusual occurred. Some called out encouragement, others made jokes about my last phone call, but I barely heard them. My execution was scheduled for March 15th, less than 3 weeks away. Warden Patricia Hayes waited in her office with my attorney Rebecca Martinez, who looked like she'd driven here at breakneck speed. Her usually perfect hair was disheveled, and she clutched a legal pad covered in frantic notes. "David, sit down," the warden said, her voice carrying emotion I'd never heard before in certainty. "We've received information that requires immediate investigation." Rebecca leaned forward, eyes bright with something I hadn't seen in years. "Hope, David, a woman called claiming to have information about your case. She says she knows something about the night of the murders that could prove your innocence." My heart began racing. "What kind of information?" "She wouldn't give details over the phone," the warden explained, "but she specifically mentioned Amanda Walsh, Michael Torres, and Lisa Kim. She knew details about the case that weren't released to public." The caller had identified herself only as Lisa and insisted on speaking with law enforcement immediately. She claimed direct knowledge of what really happened on March 15, 2016, and said David Martinez was innocent of all charges. "Where is she now?" I asked, voice barely above a whisper. "We don't know," Rebecca admitted. "The call was brief, and she hung up before we could trace it, but she promised to call back tomorrow with proof." The next 24 hours were the longest of my life. Every sound in the corridor made me jump, thinking it might be Officer Rodriguez coming for another call. Sleep was impossible. I paced my small cell like a caged animal, wearing a groove in concrete floor. Words spread through prison. Carlos knocked on our shared wall in Morse code, tapping out HOP repeatedly. Even Billy Thompson seemed affected, quiet in the cell to my right. Guards were acting differently too. Officer Williams, who usually took pleasure in my misery, avoided eye contact during rounds. Officer Rodriguez kept finding excuses to walk past my cell, offering small smiles and encouraging nods. At exactly 2:47 p.m. the following day, 24 hours after the first call, the phone rang again. I was escorted back to the warden's office where a crowd had gathered. The warden, my attorney, Detective Morrison who'd arrested me, and Assistant District Attorney Karen Walsh, all sat around a speakerphone like it was a crystal ball. "This is Warden Hayes," she answered. "You called yesterday about David Martinez." "My name is Lisa Kim," the voice said, clear and steady. "I was supposedly murdered on March 15, 2016. I'm calling to tell you that David Martinez is innocent, and I can prove it." The silence was deafening. Detective Morrison's face went white. Ada Walsh scribbled notes so frantically her pen tore through paper. Rebecca Martinez grabbed my hand and squeezed so hard I thought she might break my fingers. "Ma'am," the warden said carefully, "Lisa Kim is deceased. We have forensic evidence confirming her death." "You have evidence confirming that someone died," Lisa corrected. "But it wasn't me, and it wasn't Amanda Walsh or Michael Torres either. We're all alive, and we're ready to come forward." She explained she was currently in Los Angeles. Amanda was in Seattle, Michael in Phoenix. They'd been living under new identities for nearly 8 years, but news of my impending execution had finally forced them to confront what they'd done. "We never meant for an innocent man to be convicted," Lisa continued. "We thought police would eventually figure out that no one had actually been murdered. When the call ended, the room remained silent for a full minute. Finally, Detective Morrison spoke. "This changes everything. Amanda Walsh's fake death certificate was a masterpiece of bureaucratic deception. An official document bearing the county coroner's seal, complete with falsified autopsy details and forged signature. It had cost her $15,000, and represented the price of freedom from an unbearable life." Within 12 hours of Lisa's phone call, Amanda was on a plane from Seattle to face consequences of a decision made 8 years ago. The woman who walked into the FBI field office bore little resemblance to the Amanda Walsh from crime scene photos. Her once long blonde hair was now short and dark brown. Colored contacts changed blue eyes to hazel. Subtle plastic surgery altered her nose and cheekbones, but when she spoke, her voice carried 8 years of guilt. "My real name is Amanda Walsh," she began, sitting across from FBI agent Rebecca Martinez. "I was born in Portland in 1988. I supposedly died on March 15, 2016. But as you can see, I'm very much alive." Amanda's story began with marriage to Robert Walsh when she was 22. What started as fairy tale romance quickly devolved into nightmare of emotional and physical abuse. Robert controlled every aspect of her life: finances, friendships, career choices, even clothing. "He checked my phone constantly," Amanda explained, hands trembling. "He had tracking apps on my car, laptop, everything. I couldn't go to the grocery store without him knowing exactly where I was and how long I stayed." The abuse escalated over time. Verbal harassment evolved into physical violence. Robert would apologize after each incident, promise to change, convince Amanda she was somehow responsible. Classic domestic violence patterns thousands of women experience yearly. "I tried to leave twice," Amanda continued. "First time, he found me within 3 days. He'd hired a private investigator. Second time, he threatened to kill my younger sister if I didn't come back." Amanda had been working as an accountant, but Robert forced her to quit when he decided male colleagues were flirting with her. He isolated her from friends and family, creating a prison without bars, just as effective as any cell. The breaking point came in early 2016, when Amanda discovered she was pregnant. The idea of bringing a child into their toxic relationship filled her with horror, but Robert was ecstatic. He saw pregnancy as another way to control her, another chain binding her permanently. "I knew I had to get out," Amanda said, wiping tears. "But I also knew if I tried to leave again, he would kill me. He'd threatened it so many times I had no doubt he meant it." That's when Amanda met Marcus Webb, a man specializing in helping people disappear. Webb operated in gray areas between legal and illegal, providing new identities for people fleeing domestic violence, stalkers, or dangerous situations. His services were expensive but effective. Marcus explained that simple disappearance wouldn't work, Amanda said. Robert would never stop looking. But if I were dead, officially legally dead, he would have no reason to search. The plan was elaborate but simple. Amanda would stage her death in a way that left enough forensic evidence to convince investigators but allowed her to escape. Undetected, Webb had contacts in the coroner's office who could falsify death certificates and autopsy reports for the right price. "I was supposed to die alone," Amanda explained. "But then Marcus told me about Michael and leased to other people who needed to disappear for similar reasons. He suggested we stage a triple murder to make it more convincing and split costs. None of them had any idea police would arrest an innocent man for their fake deaths. They assumed investigators would eventually realize no actual murders occurred. When no bodies were found, when no physical evidence pointed to real crime, we used pig's blood from a butcher shop," Amanda admitted, voice barely audible. "We planted it around the apartment, made it look like a struggle. We even scattered our own hair and clothing fibers to make it seem more realistic. The hardest part was watching news coverage of their supposed deaths and seeing pain on families' faces." Amanda's parents held a funeral with an empty casket. Her sister sobbed at graveside, mourning a woman who was alive and living as Jennifer Walsh in Seattle. "I wanted to tell them so many times," Amanda said. "Every birthday, every holiday, wanted to call and let them know I was okay. But I knew if word got back to Robert somehow, he would find me." For 8 years, Amanda lived with guilt of her deception. She got a job as a bookkeeper under her false identity, rented a small apartment, tried to build normal life. She even started dating someone, a kind man named David, who knew nothing about her past. But when she saw news reports about my impending execution, the weight of her secret became unbearable. An innocent man was going to die because of a lie she helped create. "I couldn't live with myself if David Martinez was executed," she said, looking directly at the recording camera. "Whatever happens to me now, whatever price I pay for what I did, it's worth it to save an innocent man's life." The casino security footage from the Mohegan Sun in Phoenix, Arizona, showed a man who was supposed to be dead playing blackjack at Table 7 on March 20, 2016, 5 days after his alleged murder. Michael Torres, now calling himself Miguel Santos, was clearly visible in the high-definition recording. His distinctive tattoo of a soaring eagle on his left forearm impossible to miss. Michael's surrender to authorities in Phoenix came 12 hours after Amanda's confession in Los Angeles. Unlike Amanda's dramatic physical transformation, Michael had changed very little about his appearance. He'd grown a beard and gained about 30 pounds, but his basic features remained the same. Perhaps he'd felt safer hiding in plain sight, or maybe he'd simply lacked the resources for extensive cosmetic changes. "I never wanted anyone to get hurt," were his first words to FBI agent Carlos Ramirez when he walked into the Phoenix Field office. "Especially not some innocent guy I never even met." Michael's story was one of addiction, desperation, and the kind of bad decisions that spiral out of control until there's no way back. It started innocently, a construction worker who enjoyed the occasional poker game with friends, a few dollars here and there on football games. But what began as harmless entertainment evolved into a compulsion that consumed his life. "It started small," Michael explained, his calloused hands fidgeting with a stress ball as he spoke. $20 on a basketball game, maybe 50 on a poker night, but the more I won, the more I wanted to win. And when I started losing, I kept betting bigger amounts, trying to win it all back." By 2015, Michael was gambling away his entire paycheck. Within days of receiving it, he'd maxed out every credit card, borrowed against his 401k, and taken out payday loans at interest rates that would have made loan sharks blush. His wife Maria had left him, taking their 2 young children and moving back to her mother's house. "In Tucson, I was living in that duplex because it was the cheapest place I could find," Michael said. "The landlord didn't do credit checks, and he let me pay week to week when I couldn't make the monthly rent." The real trouble began when Michael started borrowing money from Vinny Carlisle, a local bookie who operated out of a strip mall sports bar. Vinny's loans came with reasonable interest rates initially, but the terms changed dramatically when borrowers fell behind on payments. "At first, Vinny was like your best friend," Michael recalled. "He'd front you money for bets, give you insider tips, make you feel like you were part of some exclusive club. But when you couldn't pay him back, that's when you met the real Vinny." By early 2016, Michael owed Vinny $47,000. The weekly interest payments alone were more than Michael's take-home pay from his construction job. Vinny's patience was wearing thin, and his collection methods were becoming increasingly violent. "He sent 2 guys to my job site," Michael said, unconsciously rubbing a scar on his left temple. "They worked me over pretty good, told me I had 1 week to come up with at least half the money, or they'd start breaking bones." Michael knew he couldn't come up with $23,000 in a week. He'd already sold everything of value. He owned his truck was repossessed. His credit was destroyed. Even his own family had stopped answering his calls for help. That's when he met Marcus Webb through a bartender who'd mentioned knowing someone who helped people with complicated situations. Webb's services weren't cheap, but they offered something. Michael desperately needed a permanent solution to his Vinny problem. "Marcus explained it to me like a business proposition," Michael said. "For $15,000, I could disappear completely. New identity, new social security number, clean credit history. Vinny would stop looking for a dead man." The irony wasn't lost on Michael that he was paying $15,000 to escape a debt of $47,000. But Webb's plan offered something money couldn't buy: his life. Vinny's threats had escalated to include Michael's ex-wife and children, and Michael knew the man wasn't bluffing. "I couldn't let anything happen to Maria and the kids because of my mistakes," Michael said, his voice breaking slightly. "They didn't deserve to pay for my stupidity." The staged crime scene was Michael's idea. As a construction worker, he knew how to make something look convincingly damaged. He suggested using pig's blood and scattered debris to simulate a violent struggle, and he helped arrange the apartment to look like a murder scene. "We thought the cops would figure it out eventually," Michael admitted. "I mean, 3 people supposedly murdered, but no bodies ever found. We figured they'd investigate for a few weeks, maybe a few months, then file it as an unsolved case. None of them anticipated that the police would plant evidence to frame an innocent man. They certainly never imagined that someone would be arrested, tried, and sentenced to death for crimes that never actually occurred." After his death, Michael relocated to Phoenix and found work on construction sites using his new identity. The constant physical labor helped manage his gambling urges, and the fear of Vinny discovering he was alive kept him away from casinos and sportsbooks, at least initially. "I stayed clean for about 6 months, Michael confessed. "But addiction doesn't just disappear because you change your name. Eventually, I started gambling again. Small amounts at first." The casino security footage that would help prove my innocence was recorded during one of Michael's He'd won $800 playing blackjack and was feeling invincible when the cameras captured him, celebrating at the table. "When I saw the news about David Martinez's execution date, I couldn't sleep," Michael said. "I kept thinking about his family, about what they were going through. I kept thinking about how this guy was going to die because of something I did." The life insurance policy that Lisa Kim had purchased 6 months before her supposed death was a $2 million term life policy through a Metropolitan Life Insurance Company. The document, with its pristine corporate letterhead and official stamps, represented the most calculated aspect of the entire deception. A woman so desperate to save her failing business that she was willing to fake her own death for the payout. Lisa was the last of the 3 victims to surrender herself. Two authorities, arriving at the FBI field office in Los Angeles 48 hours after Michael's confession in Phoenix. Unlike Amanda's dramatic transformation or Michael's modest changes, Lisa had undergone the most sophisticated identity reconstruction of all three: extensive plastic surgery, hair transplants, dental work, and even a subtle change to her voice through speech therapy had transformed her into someone virtually unrecognizable. "I want to start by saying that David Martinez is completely innocent," Lisa said as her first statement to FBI agent Rebecca Martinez. "Everything that's happened to him is my fault, and I'll spend the rest of my life trying to make it right." Lisa's path to desperation began with what should have been a success story. In 2010, she'd opened Kim's Kitchen, a small restaurant specializing in Korean-American fusion cuisine. The restaurant was her dream, a way to honor her grandmother's recipes while building something entirely her own. For the first 3 years, business was steady, even profitable, but success in the restaurant industry is notoriously fragile, and a series of setbacks in 2014 began Lisa's slide toward financial ruin. First, the city doubled the rent on her commercial space when her lease came up for renewal. Then, a kitchen fire caused by faulty wiring shut down the restaurant for 6 weeks while insurance companies fought over coverage. When Kim's Kitchen finally reopened, many of her regular customers had found new favorite restaurants. The sixth closure had broken the dining habits that took years to establish. Revenue dropped by 60% almost immediately, and it never recovered. By early 2016, Lisa owed nearly $400,000 to various creditors. The restaurant was losing money every month it stayed open, but closing would trigger personal guarantees that would bankrupt her completely. She was trapped in a financial death spiral with no apparent escape. That's when Lisa discovered Marcus Webb through a business associate who'd mentioned knowing someone who helped people start over when their situations became impossible. Webb's initial suggestion was simple bankruptcy and relocation, but Lisa's debts included personal guarantees that would follow her anywhere. The life insurance policy was Webb's idea, a way to generate enough money to pay for the identity change and provide Lisa with a nest egg to start over. The policy required a 6-month waiting period before it would pay out for suicide, but there was no waiting period for murder victims. The plan required Lisa to pay premiums on the policy for 6 months while slowly establishing the groundwork for her fake death. She had to make the policy appear legitimate, which meant regular premium payments and maintaining the policy in good standing. "We never intended for anyone to get arrested," Lisa insisted. "We thought the police would investigate, find no bodies, realize no murders had actually occurred, and close the case as a hoax or elaborate fraud." Instead, an innocent man was arrested, convicted, and sentenced to death while Lisa lived comfortably in Costa Rica under the name Alina Rodriguez, slowly spending the $2 million that had cost me 7 years of my life. Seeing David Martinez's face on the news, knowing he was going to die for something that never happened, I couldn't live with that, Lisa said, tears streaming down her reconstructed face. No amount of money is worth an innocent man's life. Detective Ray Morrison's personal notebook became the smoking gun that exposed the entire conspiracy. 47 pages of handwritten notes, phone numbers, and cryptic references that painted a picture of corruption so deep it reached into the highest levels of law enforcement. The notebook, discovered during a federal raid on Morrison's home, contained detailed plans for framing me and financial records of payments received for ensuring my conviction. The unraveling began within hours of Lisa Kim's confession. Federal investigators, working around the clock, started connecting dots that had been invisible for 7 years. What they discovered was a web of corruption that made the fake deaths seem like amateur hour compared to the sophisticated conspiracy that had destroyed my life. Morrison hadn't just been incompetent, he'd been actively criminal. His notebook contained entries dating back to early 2016, weeks before the alleged murders even occurred. Phone numbers in the margins connected him to Vincent "Vinny" Carlisle, the same bookie who'd been threatening Michael Torres. March 10th, Vinny says he needs a body. Big debt problem going away soon. Read one entry in Morrison's cramped handwriting. March 12th, Webb says 3 packages need delivery. Good timing. The FBI's Financial Crimes Unit traced more bank accounts and discovered a series of cash deposits totaling over $200,000 in the months following my arrest. The deposits were carefully structured to avoid federal reporting requirements, never more than $9,000 at a time. Always in cash, always accompanied by mundane explanations like consulting fees or overtime payments. But Morrison was just one piece of a much larger puzzle. His notebook contained references to the judge, the doc, and the prosecutor, code names for other participants in the conspiracy. As federal investigators dug deeper, they uncovered a criminal organization that had been operating for years. Judge Patricia Hawkins, who had presided over my trial, had received a new Mercedes-Benz 3 months after sentencing me to death. The car was purchased by a shell company that traced back to the same criminal network that had helped the 3 victims fake their deaths. Dr. Amanda Foster, the forensic expert whose DNA testimony had sealed my fate, had received research grants totaling $50,000 from a foundation that existed only on paper. The motive was both simpler and more complex than anyone had imagined. Vinnie Carlisle's gambling operation was just the tip of an iceberg that included drug trafficking, money laundering, and human trafficking. When Michael Torres accumulated a debt he couldn't pay, and when Lisa Kim needed to disappear, along with $2 million in insurance money, the organization saw an opportunity to solve multiple problems with one elaborate scheme. That's where I came in. Morrison's notes revealed that I'd been selected as the perfect patsy weeks before the staged murders even occurred. My profile fit their needs precisely: a working-class man with no significant family wealth to hire expensive lawyers, no political connections to complicate the prosecution, and no criminal history that might make my guilt seem implausible. Martinez, auto shop, lives alone, brother but not close, no money for good lawyer, one entry read, perfect for package delivery. The conspiracy reached even deeper than anyone had initially suspected. Assistant District Attorney Karen Walsh, who had prosecuted my case with such conviction, had received campaign contributions for her planned run for district attorney from donors connected to the criminal organization. Even some of the witnesses against me had been compromised. Maria Santos, the nurse who claimed to have seen me leaving the crime scene, had gambling debts to Vinnie Carlisle that were mysteriously forgiven shortly after her testimony. Jerome Mitchell, the convenience store clerk who claimed I'd asked about the victim's schedules, had received a job promotion and raise immediately after the trial ended. The DNA evidence that had seemed so damning was the most sophisticated part of the conspiracy. Morrison's notes revealed that my DNA had been collected from a discarded coffee cup I'd thrown away at a gas station near my shop. The same criminal network that specialized in creating false identities also had contacts in forensic laboratories, who could plant evidence in ways that would pass standard scrutiny. Morrison's personal notebook became evidence in 17 different federal cases. By the time investigators finished following every lead, they'd arrested 23 people, on charges ranging from conspiracy to commit murder to racketeering to witness tampering. The newspaper headlines from March 1, 2024, told a story that Hollywood couldn't have invented. Death row inmates' victims come forward alive, screamed across the front page of the Los Angeles Times in bold black letters. The collection of headlines from that week would become a testament to how quickly the impossible can become reality. When truth finally emerges from the shadows, within hours of the 3 confessions becoming public, my case transformed from a routine death penalty appeal into the most sensational criminal justice story in decades. News vans lined the streets outside Riverside Correctional Institution. Reporters from around the world descended on the small town like an invading army, all desperate to be the first to interview the man who'd spent 7 years on death row for murders that never happened. My new legal team, assembled virtually overnight, was unlike anything I'd experienced during my original trial. Rebecca Martinez, my original public defender who'd believed in my innocence from the beginning, was now joined by Marcus Thompson from the Innocence Project and David Chen, a high-profile criminal defense attorney who specialized in wrongful conviction cases. This isn't just about David Martinez anymore, Thompson explained during our first strategy meeting in the prison's legal conference room. This case represents everything wrong with our criminal justice system. We're not just fighting for your freedom, we're fighting to expose a level of corruption that most people can't even imagine. The state's response was immediate and defensive. District Attorney Karen Walsh, the same prosecutor who'd sought my death sentence 7 years earlier, held a press conference announcing that her office would thoroughly investigate these new allegations while maintaining that the original conviction was based on solid evidence and proper procedures. But the evidence was crumbling faster than the state could defend it. Each day brought new revelations about the conspiracy that had destroyed my life. Morrison's arrest made front-page news. Dr. Foster's research grants became the subject of federal investigation. Judge Hawkins's mysterious Mercedes-Benz triggered ethics inquiries that would eventually end her career. My first television interview was with Anderson Cooper on CNN. The prison had set up a special media room for the occasion, and I found myself sitting across from one of the most recognizable journalists in America, still wearing my orange death row uniform. "David, how does it feel to know that you came within weeks of being executed for crimes that never even occurred?" Cooper asked, his voice carrying the gravity of the situation. "It feels surreal," I admitted, still struggling to process the magnitude of what had happened. "For 7 years, I've been trying to convince people that I was innocent. Now I find out that not only was I innocent, but there weren't even any crimes to be innocent of." The interview aired on a Tuesday night and was watched by over 2 million people. Public opinion shifted dramatically in my favor. Online petitions demanding my immediate release collected hundreds of thousands of signatures within days. Celebrities began tweeting about my case using the hashtag #FreeInnocentDavid. But the state wasn't giving up without a fight. Despite the overwhelming evidence of my innocence, prosecutors argued that proper legal procedures still needed to be followed. They claimed that even if the original convictions were flawed, I needed to go through the standard appeals process rather than being immediately released. The most surreal moment came when the 3 people whose fake deaths had nearly cost me my life, appeared together on Good Morning America. Amanda, Michael, and Lisa sat side by side, looking nervous but determined as they told their stories to a national audience. "We never intended for anyone to get hurt," Amanda said, her voice breaking with emotion. "We were just trying to escape our own problems. I never imagined that an innocent person would be blamed for our fake deaths." Watching them on the small television in the prison's common area, surrounded by other death row inmates who were cheering and crying, I felt a complex mixture of gratitude and anger. These people had saved my life by coming forward, but they'd also destroyed 7 years of it with their original deception. The media attention was both a blessing and a curse. It put enormous pressure on the state to act quickly, but it also turned my personal tragedy into public entertainment. Every detail of my case was dissected on cable news shows. Legal experts debated the finer points of my situation on Sunday morning talk shows. But the headlines that mattered most were the ones announcing new developments in the investigation. Each arrest, each revelation, each piece of evidence that emerged brought me closer to freedom and brought those who'd wronged me closer to justice. The joint affidavit signed by Amanda Walsh, Michael Torres, and Lisa Kim on March 5, 2024, was a legal document unlike any other in American jurisprudence. Sworn statement by 3 alleged murder victims confessing to faking their own deaths and exonerating the man condemned to die for killing them. The document, notarized and witnessed by federal agents, represented the final nail in the coffin of the case against me. The coordinated surrender of all 3 had been planned meticulously. After Lisa's initial phone call, federal agents had worked with each of them to ensure their safety while they prepared to face the consequences of their 8-year deception. The logistics were complex. Amanda flying in from Seattle, Michael driving from Phoenix, and Lisa arriving from Costa Rica, under heavy federal protection. Their first public appearance together was at a press conference held at the FBI field office in Los Angeles. I watched it live from the prison's administrative office, surrounded by guards, prison officials, and my legal team. Seeing the 3 people whose supposed deaths had nearly cost me my life sitting together at a conference table was surreal beyond description. Amanda spoke first, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was admitting. "My name is Amanda Walsh, and I was not murdered on March 15, 2016. I faked my death to escape an abusive marriage, and I am directly responsible for David Martinez's wrongful conviction." She explained her transformation, the years of living under a false identity, and the guilt that had consumed her as my execution date approached. Her emotional testimony about domestic violence added a human dimension to the story that resonated with viewers around the world. Michael followed, his construction worker's hands shaking as he gripped the microphone. "I'm Michael Torres, and I'm supposed to be dead too. I faked my death because I owed money to dangerous people, and I thought it was my only way out. I never meant for anyone else to get hurt." His confession about his gambling addiction and the threats from Vinnie Carlisle provided crucial context for understanding how the conspiracy had begun. When he described watching the news coverage of my trial and feeling helpless to come forward, several reporters in the audience were visibly moved. Lisa's statement was the most clinical and detailed. As the architect of the insurance fraud scheme, she had the most to lose by coming forward, but also the clearest understanding of how their deception had spiraled out of control. "I orchestrated an insurance fraud that cost an innocent man 7 years of his life," she said, her reconstructed face showing emotion despite the plastic surgery. "I will spend the rest of my life trying to make amends for what I've done." The questions from reporters were intense and sometimes hostile. How could they have remained silent for so long? Did they understand that their actions had nearly resulted in the execution of an innocent man? What did they hope to accomplish by coming forward now? "We're not heroes," Amanda answered when asked about their decision to finally tell the truth. "We're criminals who made terrible mistakes that destroyed an innocent man's life. We're coming forward because it's the right thing to do, even though it's 7 years too late." The joint affidavit they signed was extraordinary in its thoroughness. Over 17 pages, they detailed every aspect of their deception: how they met Marcus Webb, how they planned the fake crime scene, how they obtained new identities, and how they'd lived with their secret for 8 years. Most importantly, the affidavit categorically stated that David Martinez had never met any of them, had no knowledge of their plans, and was completely innocent of any wrongdoing. They took full responsibility for the consequences of their actions and expressed their willingness to cooperate fully with all ongoing investigations. The public reaction was mixed and intense. Many people expressed sympathy for Amanda's situation as a domestic violence victim and understanding for Michael's desperation to escape violent creditors, but there was widespread anger about the 8 years they'd remained silent while an innocent man sat on death row. The victims' families, the real victims who'd mourned their supposedly dead relatives for 8 years, faced their own complex emotions. Amanda's parents held a press conference expressing relief that their daughter was alive but heartbreak over the deception. Michael's ex-wife Maria spoke about the trauma of explaining to their children that their father wasn't actually dead. "Part of me is grateful that he's alive," Maria said during a television interview. But another part of me is furious that he let us grieve for 8 years while he was living a new life somewhere else. For me, watching from prison, the emotions were equally complex. These 3 people had saved my life by coming forward, but they'd also destroyed 7 years of it with their original deception. I felt gratitude, anger, confusion, and relief all at the same time. The legal implications of their confessions were immediate and far-reaching. Prosecutors announced that all charges against me would be dropped, pending a formal court hearing. The FBI expanded their investigation into the conspiracy that had framed me. Immigration authorities began proceedings against Elisa for illegal entry under a false identity. But perhaps most significantly, their joint confession forced a reckoning with the criminal justice system that had failed so Had the police, prosecutors, forensic experts, and courts been so easily deceived? How many other innocent people might be sitting in prison because of similar conspiracies? The 3 people whose fake deaths had nearly cost me my life were now the key witnesses in exposing the corruption that had made my wrongful conviction possible. Their courage in coming forward, however belated, had not only saved my life, but potentially prevented other innocent people from suffering the same fate. The bank records that federal investigators uncovered painted a clear picture of corruption that stretched far beyond Detective Morrison's personal greed financial paper trail, showing systematic payments totaling over $3 million, distributed among corrupt officials over a 5-year period. These records, subpoenaed from 17 different financial institutions, revealed the true scope of the criminal organization that had nearly cost me my life. At the center of the conspiracy was Vincent "Vinny" Carlisle, whose gambling operation had evolved into something far more sinister than simple bookmaking. FBI surveillance revealed that Vinny's sports bar was actually the headquarters for a criminal enterprise that included money laundering, witness intimidation, evidence tampering, and what investigators termed conviction for hire, the ability to frame innocent people for crimes they didn't commit. Carlisle wasn't just a bookie. FBI agent Rebecca Martinez explained during a federal task force briefing that was later leaked to the media. He was running a full-service criminal organization that could solve problems for clients in ways that legitimate businesses never could. The bank records showed that Vinny's organization had perfected the art of corruption through small, regular payments that flew under federal reporting requirements. Detective Morrison received $2,000 per month for 5 years' money. That was listed in Vinny's books as consulting fees for security advice. Dr. Amanda Foster received quarterly payments of $4,500, described as research grants for forensic studies that never actually existed. Judge Patricia Hawkins was more expensive, receiving a $20,000 speaking fee for a legal conference that was never held, plus the Mercedes-Benz that was technically purchased by a shell company and then donated to her as a prize in a charity auction that had only one bidder. But the most shocking discovery was that my case wasn't unique. The bank records revealed payments related to at least 12 other criminal cases over the previous 5 years. The organization had been selling convictions like a commodity, with prices varying based on the severity of the charges and the complexity of the frame-up required. They had a menu of services, Agent Martinez explained. Simple assault charges were relatively cheap, maybe $20,000 total in bribes. But capital murder cases like Martinez's required more extensive corruption and cost significantly more. The financial trail led investigators to Marcus Webb, the man who specialized in creating false identities and staging fake deaths. Webb wasn't just helping people disappear, he was also providing the criminal organization with a steady supply of crimes that needed solving and evidence that could be manipulated to frame innocent people. Webb's operation was sophisticated beyond anything law enforcement had previously encountered. He maintained safe houses in 12 states, employed dozens of people who specialized in everything from document forgery to plastic surgery, and had contacts in government agencies that could provide legitimate-looking false documentation. Webb was essentially running a criminal corporation, Agent Martinez said. He had employees, management structure, quality control processes, and customer service protocols. It was organized crime disguised as a business. The target selection process for frame-ups was particularly calculated. The organization maintained detailed profiles of potential scapegoats, people who fit specific criteria that made them ideal candidates for wrongful conviction. They preferred working-class individuals without significant financial resources, people with limited social connections who wouldn't generate much public sympathy, and those with no criminal history who wouldn't seem like obvious suspects. They studied the psychology of juries, Agent Martinez explained. They knew exactly what type of defendant would be most likely to get convicted based on appearance, background, and circumstances. I had been selected weeks before the fake murders were even staged. Morrison's notes showed that the organization had researched my finances, my family relationships, my work schedule, and even my personality profile. They'd determined that I was the perfect patsy, isolated enough to frame, innocent enough to be believable, and poor enough to receive inadequate legal representation. The DNA evidence that had seemed so damning was planted using sophisticated techniques that the organization had perfected over years of practice. They had contacts in forensic laboratories who could introduce foreign DNA samples into evidence without triggering standard quality control procedures. They didn't just plant evidence, Agent Martinez said. They created an entire false reality supported by corrupted forensic science. The witness testimonies that had convicted me were equally fabricated. Maria Santos, the nurse who claimed to have seen me leaving the crime scene, owed Vinnie Carlisle $37,000 in gambling debts that were forgiven immediately after my trial. Jerome Mitchell, the convenience store clerk who testified about my alleged inquiries, had been arrested for drug possession, but had the charges mysteriously dropped after he agreed to testify. The arrests began on March 8, 2024, with simultaneous federal raids in 6 states. Vinnie Carlisle was arrested at his sports bar, still conducting business as if nothing had changed. Marcus Webb was captured at a safe house in Nevada. Dr. Foster was arrested at her laboratory, in the middle of processing evidence for another case that investigators would later determine was also compromised. Detective Morrison, already in federal custody, began cooperating with investigators in exchange for a reduced sentence. His testimony revealed even more corruption than the bank records had suggested, including cases where innocent people had been framed for crimes that actually occurred, not just fake crimes like mine. The financial records became evidence in over 40 separate federal cases. By the time investigators finished following every transaction, they'd uncovered a criminal organization that had been operating across state lines for nearly a decade, generating millions in revenue while destroying countless innocent lives in the process. But the most important discovery was that my case had been their masterpiece, the most elaborate and expensive frame-up they'd ever attempted, and ultimately, the one that brought down their entire operation. The exoneration order signed by Judge Maria Rodriguez on March 10, 2024, was a single page that erased 7 years of hell with the stroke of a pen. The document, bearing the official seal of the Superior Court and marked urgent in red letters, declared that all charges against David Martinez were hereby dismissed with prejudice and that he was to be released immediately from state custody. I held the document in my trembling hands as Judge Rodriguez read it aloud in a packed courtroom. After 7 years of legal documents that had only brought bad news, denial of appeals, rejection of petitions, scheduling of execution dates, this piece of paper represented something I'd almost stopped believing in. Justice, the court finds that newly discovered evidence conclusively establishes the innocence of David Martinez. Judge Rodriguez declared, her voice carrying across a courtroom filled with reporters, supporters, and curiosity seekers. All charges are hereby dismissed, and Mr. Martinez is ordered released from custody immediately. The moment the gavel fell, the courtroom erupted. My legal team, Rebecca Martinez, Marcus Thompson, and David Chun, embraced each other and me, with tears streaming down their faces. Behind us, the gallery was filled with people who'd supported me through the years. Fellow inmates, families who'd written letters, advocates from the Innocence Project, and complete strangers who'd followed my case and believed in my innocence. But the most emotional moment came when I saw my brother Miguel in the front row. We'd barely spoken during my 7 years on death row. My conviction had destroyed our relationship, as he'd struggled to reconcile the brother he'd known with the monster the state claimed I was. Now, with tears in his eyes, he was the first person to hug me as a free man. "I'm sorry I doubted you," he whispered in my ear. "I'm so sorry." The walk from the courtroom to the prison exit was surreal. 7 years earlier, I'd been led into this building in shackles, presumed guilty by everyone who saw me. Now I was walking out in a donated suit, vindicated and free, but forever changed by the experience. The media circus outside was overwhelming. Dozens of cameras and microphones were thrust in my face as reporters shouted questions about my plans, my feelings, my intentions for the future. All I could think about was breathing fresh air that didn't smell like disinfectant and concrete. "How does it feel to be free?" one reporter shouted. "Surreal," I answered honestly. "I've dreamed about this moment for 7 years, but I never really believed it would happen." My first step outside the prison walls was unlike anything I'd experienced. In my entire life, the ground felt different under my feet, not because it actually was different, but because I was walking on it as a free man. The sky looked bluer, the air tasted sweeter, and every sensation was amplified by the knowledge that I could go wherever I wanted, whenever I wanted. The adjustment to freedom was immediate and overwhelming. Simple choices that I'd taken for granted before my conviction, what to eat, where to go, when to sleep, suddenly required decisions I'd forgotten how to make. Miguel had arranged for me to stay at his house temporarily, but even riding in a car felt strange after 7 years of controlled movement. "The world has changed a lot since 2016, Miguel explained as we drove through streets that looked familiar but different. "Everyone has smartphones now. Social media is everywhere. Even the way people pay for things has changed." The first meal I ate as a free man was at a small Mexican restaurant near Miguel's house. The ability to choose my own food, to eat with real silverware instead of plastic utensils, to take as long as I wanted to finish my meal. These simple pleasures felt like luxuries beyond imagination, but freedom also brought unexpected challenges. The constant noise of traffic, conversations, and everyday life was overwhelming after years of controlled prison sounds. The abundance of choices in a simple grocery store was paralyzing. Even sleeping in a real bed felt strange after years. On a narrow prison cot, the media attention continued relentlessly. My phone, a device I'd barely used before my conviction, rang constantly with interview requests, book offers, and movie rights inquiries. Everyone wanted to tell my story, but I wasn't sure I was ready to relive it for public consumption. The most difficult part of my immediate freedom was processing the complex emotions I felt toward Amanda, Michael, and Lisa. They had saved my life by coming forward, but they had also destroyed 7 years of it with their original deception. Gratitude and anger coexisted uncomfortably in my mind. During my first week of freedom, I received a letter from Amanda Walsh written from federal custody, where she was awaiting trial for her role in the insurance fraud scheme. "I know that saying I'm sorry isn't enough," she wrote. "I know that nothing I do can give you back the 7 years we took from you. But I want you to know that coming forward was the first time in 8 years that I felt like I was doing the right thing." The letter continued for 3 pages, expressing her remorse and her hope that I might someday forgive her. Similar letters arrived from Michael and Lisa, each expressing their guilt and their relief that I was finally free. My exoneration made headlines around the world. Legal experts called it one of the most dramatic wrongful conviction cases in American history. The fact that the victims were alive and that I'd been framed by a criminal conspiracy made the story almost too incredible to believe. But for me, the most important moment of my freedom came 3 days after my release, when I visited my parents' graves. They had both died while I was on death row, my father from a heart attack 2 years into my sentence, my mother from cancer 4 years later. Neither had lived to see my vindication. Standing at their gravesites holding the exoneration order in my hands, I finally allowed myself to fully process what had happened. 7 years of my life had been stolen, but I was alive, I was free, and I had the rest of my life to figure out what came next. The civil lawsuit filing against the state of California and 17 individual defendants was a 100-40-7- page document that sought $57 million in damages, $8 million for each year of wrongful imprisonment, plus additional punitive damages. The lawsuit, filed 3 weeks after my exoneration, represented more than just a quest for financial compensation. It was a demand for accountability from a system that had failed catastrophic. My legal team had expanded to include civil rights attorneys specializing in wrongful conviction cases. Leading the effort was David Shun, whose firm had secured some of the largest settlements in wrongful conviction history. "This isn't just about money," Chun explained during our first strategy meeting. "This is about sending a message that the state can't destroy innocent lives without consequences. Every dollar we recover represents accountability for what happened to you." The lawsuit named everyone who had played a role in my wrongful conviction. Detective Morrison was sued personally for evidence tampering and deprivation of civil rights. Dr. Forster faced claims for scientific fraud and perjury. Judge Hawkins was named for judicial misconduct and accepting bribes. Even the state crime laboratory was sued for its role in processing fraudulent evidence, but the most significant defendant was the state of California itself, which faced claims for systemic failures that had allowed the conspiracy to operate unchecked. The lawsuit alleged that inadequate oversight, poor training, and institutional indifference had created an environment where corruption could flourish. The state has a constitutional obligation to ensure fair trials and prevent wrongful convictions, Chen argued in our court filings. When that system fails as spectacularly as it did in Mr. Martinez's case, the state must be held financially responsible. The financial calculations were complex but devastating. $8 million per year represented the value of freedom, calculated using established precedents for wrongful conviction settlements. Additional damages covered medical expenses for the psychological trauma I'd suffered, lost earning capacity from 7 years out of the workforce, and punitive damages designed to deter future misconduct. The state's initial response was predictably defensive. Attorney General Patricia Walsh filed motions arguing that the state couldn't be held responsible for the actions of corrupt individuals and that sovereign immunity protected many government functions from civil lawsuits. The state maintains that Detective Morrison and others acted outside the scope of their employment when they engaged in criminal conduct. The Attorney General's office argued, individual bad actors cannot create liability for the entire system. But our evidence painted a different picture. The conspiracy had operated for years without detection, suggesting systemic failures in oversight and accountability. Internal memos revealed that concerns about Morrison's conduct had been raised and ignored. Budget documents showed that the crime laboratory was understaffed and undersupervised, creating opportunities for evidence tampering. My testimony during the civil depositions was emotionally draining, but legally necessary. For hours at a time, I recounted the details of my wrongful conviction, my years on death row, and the psychological impact of facing execution for crimes I didn't commit. Describe for the court your emotional state during the final weeks before your scheduled execution, Chen prompted during one particularly difficult session. I was preparing to die for something I didn't do, I answered, my voice breaking slightly. I was writing letters to family members, trying to find peace with the fact that I would be remembered as a monster when I was actually innocent. The psychological torture of that situation is impossible to describe. The state offered its first settlement proposal 6 months after the lawsuit was filed. $12 million with no admission of wrongdoing. My legal team rejected it immediately, as grossly inadequate, given the magnitude of the injustice I'd suffered. $12 million is less than $2 million per year of wrongful imprisonment, Chen explained. That's far below the standard compensation for wrongful conviction cases, and it doesn't account for the fact that you are facing execution. The negotiation process was complicated by ongoing criminal cases against the conspirators who'd framed me. Prosecutors needed my cooperation as a witness in their cases against Morrison, Carlisle, Webb, and others. Any civil settlement couldn't interfere with my obligation to testify in those criminal proceedings. Meanwhile, I was pursuing compensation through other avenues. California had a victim compensation fund for people wrongfully convicted of crimes, but the maximum payout was only $140,000 per year of imprisonment, far less than what my civil lawsuit sought. The Innocence Project helped me apply for federal compensation programs, though these were limited and often inadequate. Some states had specific statutes providing compensation for wrongful convictions, but California's law was among the least generous in the nation. The irony is that if you'd been wrongfully convicted in Texas or New York, you'd be eligible for much more compensation, Chen explained. California talks a good game about criminal justice reform, but when it comes to compensating victims of wrongful conviction, they're behind most other states. The most frustrating aspect of seeking compensation was the bureaucratic indifference. I encountered government officials who should have been horrified by my ordeal, instead treated my case like a routine administrative matter. Forms to fill out, procedures to follow, deadlines to meet, as if 7 years on death row was just another government mistake to be processed and filed away. The psychological evaluation required for my compensation claim was particularly difficult. A court-appointed psychiatrist spent hours documenting the trauma I'd suffered, diagnosing me with PTSD, anxiety, and depression stemming from my wrongful conviction. Mr. Martinez exhibits classic symptoms of institutional trauma, the psychiatrist wrote in her report. The psychological impact of facing execution for crimes he didn't commit has created lasting emotional damage that will require years of treatment to address. Public support for my compensation claim was overwhelming. Petitions supporting a generous settlement collected hundreds of thousands of signatures. Editorial boards at major newspapers wrote pieces arguing that the state had a moral obligation to adequately compensate me for the injustice I'd suffered, but moral obligations and legal obligations weren't the same thing. The state's lawyers continued to argue that while my wrongful conviction was unfortunate, the government's liability was limited by sovereign immunity and other legal protections. The civil lawsuit filing represented my best hope for meaningful compensation, but it also represented something more important: accountability. Every defendant named in the lawsuit would have to face consequences for their role in destroying 7 years of my life. The state would have to acknowledge its failures and hopefully implement reforms to prevent future wrongful convictions. As the legal battle continued, I realized that seeking justice was almost as exhausting as being wrongfully convicted had been. The system that had failed me so catastrophically was now the same system I had to navigate to seek compensation for. That failure? The family photo from Christmas 2015, the last holiday before my arrest, sat on Miguel's kitchen table like an artifact from a different life. In the picture, our extended family gathered around our parents' dining room table, everyone smiling, and unaware that within 3 months, our world would be shattered forever. The photo represented everything I'd lost and everything I hoped to rebuild in the aftermath of my exoneration. Rebuilding relationships after 7 years of wrongful imprisonment was more complicated than I'd anticipated. The people who'd believed in my innocence welcomed me back with open arms, but those who doubted me struggled with guilt and embarrassment that made interactions awkward and painful. Miguel had been the first to embrace me after my release, but our relationship remained strained by the years of silence between us. During my trial and early imprisonment, he'd visited regularly and maintained his belief in my innocence. But as the appeals failed and the evidence seemed insurmountable, doubt had crept into his mind. "I never stopped loving you," he told me during one of our difficult conversations about the past, "but I have to be honest, there were times when I wondered if maybe you'd snapped somehow, if maybe there was something I didn't know about you." The admission hurt, but I understood it. The evidence against me had been so compelling that even people who knew me well had been forced to question everything they thought they knew. My conviction hadn't just sent me to prison, it had poisoned the memories of everyone who'd ever cared about me, my relationship, with our extended family was even more complicated. My uncle Roberto had publicly stated during my trial that he believed I was guilty and that our family needed to accept the truth. My cousins had stopped visiting after the first year, and my Aunt Carmen had refused to let her children attend family gatherings if my case was discussed. I was wrong, Uncle Roberto admitted when he finally called me 3 weeks after my exoneration. I believed what the police and the newspapers told us. I thought the evidence was too strong to deny. I'm sorry, David. I'm sorry I gave up on you. His apology was genuine, but the damage to our relationship was real. 7 years of believing I was a monster couldn't be erased with a phone call. Trust, once broken, required time and effort to rebuild. Some family members never reached out at all. My cousin Patricia, who'd been like a sister to me growing up, remained silent even after my Miguel told me she was embarrassed about her public statements supporting my conviction. But embarrassment wasn't enough to explain the complete absence of contact. The most painful relationship to navigate was with Maria Santos, the former neighborhood testified against me. Learning that her testimony had been coerced through financial pressure from Vinnie Carlisle's organization changed my feelings about her from anger to something more complex. I didn't want to lie, she told me when she finally agreed to meet at a coffee shop near her house. But they knew about my gambling debts, and they said they could make my problems go away if I helped them with their case. I was scared and desperate. Her explanation didn't excuse what she'd done, but it helped me understand the web of corruption that had destroyed my life. She wasn't evil, she was another victim of the same criminal organization that had framed me, forced to choose between her financial survival and my freedom. I've lived with the guilt every day for 7 years, she continued, tears streaming down her face. When I saw the news about your exoneration, I couldn't eat for 3 days. I kept thinking about how close you came to being executed because of my lies. Forgiving Maria was a process, not a moment. Intellectually, I understood that she'd been coerced and manipulated. Emotionally, I struggled with the fact that her testimony had been crucial to my conviction. Our conversation was the beginning of a reconciliation that would take months to fully develop. The 3 people whose fake deaths had nearly cost me my life presented the most complex relationship challenges of all. Amanda, Michael, and Lisa had all written to me multiple times from federal custody, expressing their remorse and their gratitude that I was finally free. Amanda's letters were the most frequent and detailed. She wrote about her therapy sessions in prison, her efforts to understand how her decision to fake her death had spiraled into such a catastrophe, and her plans to dedicate her life to criminal justice reform after her release. I know I can never give you back the 7 years we took from you, she wrote in one particularly moving letter, but I promise you that I will spend the rest of my life trying to prevent what happened to you from happening to anyone else. Michael's letters were shorter but equally sincere. He'd gotten clean from his gambling addiction during his incarceration and was working with prison counselors to address the underlying issues that had led to his desperate decision to fake his death. Lisa's correspondence was more practical. As the architect of the insurance fraud scheme, she felt the greatest responsibility for the consequences. She'd arranged to have a portion of the fraudulent insurance money set aside in a trust fund for my compensation, even though she wasn't legally required to do so. Meeting them in person was something I'd been avoiding but knew I eventually needed to do. The first meeting was arranged by our mutual attorneys at the federal courthouse, with all of us testifying in the criminal cases against our shared persecutors. Seeing Amanda in person was shocking. The plastic surgery and other changes to her appearance made her almost unrecognizable from the crime scene photos that had haunted my trial. But when she spoke, apologizing for the 100th time for what she'd done, I could hear the genuine remorse in her voice. I think about you every day, she said. I think about the 7 years you lost because of our selfishness. I wish I could trade places with you, give you back those years somehow. Michael was exactly what I'd expected, a broken man whose gambling addiction had destroyed multiple lives, including his own. His hands shook throughout our conversation, whether from withdrawal, nervousness, or guilt, I couldn't tell. Lisa was the most composed of the 3, but also the most distant. She apologized professionally, as if she were reading from a script, and I sensed that her remorse was genuine but complicated by her own legal troubles. The family photo on Miguel's table served as a daily reminder of what I was trying to rebuild. Some relationships could be repaired, others were permanently damaged, and a few were stronger than ever because they'd survived the ultimate test of faith and loyalty. The therapy session notes from Dr. Elizabeth Warren became a roadmap of my healing journey, 53 pages of handwritten observations, documenting my struggle to process 7 years of psychological trauma while learning to live as a free man again. These notes, which I obtained copies of for my own understanding, revealed the depth of damage that wrongful conviction had inflicted on my mind and spirit. My first therapy session took place 2 weeks after my release. In Dr. Warren's office, overlooking a small park where children played on swings and slides, the contrast between their carefree laughter and my internal turmoil was jarring. I'd agreed to therapy not because I wanted to talk about my feelings, but because my legal team insisted it was necessary for documenting the psychological damage from my civil lawsuit. Tell me about your sleep patterns, Dr. Warren began, her voice gentle but clinical. Are you experiencing nightmares, insomnia, or other sleep disturbances? Sleep had become my enemy. On death row, sleep was an escape from the constant stress and fear. But now, as a free man, sleep brought nightmares about returning to prison, about being executed for crimes I didn't commit, about waking up to discover that my exoneration had been just another cruel dream. I wake up at 4:30 a.m. every morning. I told her that's when they used to do the head count on death row. My body is still programmed to expect that sound of keys and voices in the corridor. Dr. Warren's notes from that session described someone exhibiting classic symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder, hypervigilance, sleep disturbances, anxiety attacks, and what she termed institutional conditioning behaviors learned in prison that were maladaptive in the outside world. The most difficult part of therapy was confronting the anger that I'd suppressed for 7 years. On death row, anger was dangerous. It could lead to fights, disciplinary action, or worse. I'd learned to swallow my rage, to turn it inward, to channel it into determination, to prove my innocence. But now, with my innocence established, that suppressed anger had nowhere to go. I'm angry at everyone, I admitted during my 4th session. I'm angry at the police who framed me, at the prosecutors who convicted me, at the judges who denied my appeals. But I'm also angry at Amanda, Michael, and Lisa for starting this whole mess. And I'm angry at myself for being so naive, for believing the system would work. Dr. Warren helped me understand that my anger was justified and healthy. For 7 years, I'd been the victim of a massive injustice, and anger was a natural response. The challenge was learning to express that anger constructively, rather than letting it consume me. Forgiveness doesn't mean excusing what was done to you, she explained. It means choosing not to let other people's actions control your emotional life. You can forgive someone while still holding them accountable for the consequences of their behavior. The concept of forgiveness was particularly complicated when it came to Amanda, Michael, and Lisa. They'd saved my life by coming forward, but they'd also destroyed 7 years of it with their original deception. Traditional notions of victim and perpetrator didn't apply when the same people filled both roles. Trust had become my biggest challenge. 7 years of wrongful imprisonment had taught me that the system couldn't be trusted, that evidence could be fabricated, that innocent people could be convicted and executed. Extending that learned mistrust to personal relationships was making it impossible to connect with people. I find myself analyzing everything people say to me. I told Dr. Warren, if someone's friendly, I wonder what they want from me. If someone's distant, I assume they still think I'm guilty. I can't take anything at face value anymore. The therapy sessions revealed layers of psychological damage I hadn't even recognized. 7 years of controlled movement had left me uncomfortable. In crowds and open spaces, 7 years of institutional food had made restaurant meals overwhelming. 7 years of scheduled activities had left me paralyzed by the freedom to choose how to spend my time. You've been institutionalized, Dr. Warren explained. Your mind and body adapted to prison life as a survival mechanism. Now you need to consciously unlearn those adaptations and relearn how to live in the outside world. One of the most surprising discoveries was that I'd developed what Dr. Warren called survivor's guilt. Guilt about being exonerated when so many other innocent people remained wrongfully imprisoned. My case had received massive media attention and legal resources that most wrongfully convicted people never get. Why had I been saved when others weren't? Every time I see a story about another wrongful conviction, I feel guilty that my case got so much attention, I confessed. There are probably hundreds of innocent people on death row right now, but they don't have 3 fake victims coming forward to save them. Dr. Warren helped me reframe this guilt as motivation for advocacy. Rather than my unique experience and public platform created opportunities to help other wrongfully convicted individuals, to push for criminal justice reform, and to prevent future miscarriages of justice. The breakthrough moment in my therapy came during my 15th session when Dr. Warren asked me to describe who I was before my arrest. I realized that I'd been defining myself entirely through the lens of my wrongful conviction. I was a wrongfully convicted person rather than David Martinez, who happened to have been wrongfully convicted. You need to reconnect with the parts of yourself that existed before this happened, she said. Your identity is more than just what was done to you. Slowly, through months of therapy, I began to rediscover aspects of my personality that had been buried under years of trauma. I remembered that I'd enjoyed working with my hands, solving mechanical problems, and building things. I recalled my sense of humor, my optimism, and my faith in basic human decency. The therapy session notes documented this gradual healing process. The first time I slept through the night without nightmares, the first time I ate at a restaurant without feeling overwhelmed, the first time I laughed genuinely at something funny rather than forcing a smile for other people's comfort. Dr. Warren's notes became a testament to the human capacity for healing and resilience. Even after 7 years of wrongful imprisonment and psychological torture, the mind could recover, relationships could be rebuilt, and life could have meaning again. The journey was longer and more difficult than I'd expected, but it was possible. The job application for Martinez Auto Repair sat on my kitchen table for 3 weeks before I finally found the courage to submit a single page that represented my attempt to reclaim the life that had been stolen from me 7 years earlier. The application was for a position at the very shop I'd coned with Miguel before my arrest. Though it now bore a different name and was under new management after my conviction had destroyed the business, starting over at 34 felt like being reborn into a world that had moved on without me. Technology had advanced in ways I struggled to comprehend. Social media dominated every aspect of daily life. Even simple tasks like paying for groceries or calling a taxi required navigating apps and systems that hadn't existed when I was arrested. "You'll figure it out," Miguel assured me as he helped me set up my first smartphone. "It's like learning to drive overwhelming at first, but it becomes second nature." But learning to use a smartphone was nothing compared to learning how to trust my own judgment again. 7 years of being told I was a monster, of having every decision made for me, of living in a system where independent thought was discouraged. These experiences had eroded my confidence in ways I was only beginning to understand. The job search was particularly challenging. Despite my exoneration and the national media attention, many employers were reluctant to hire someone with my history. The applications that asked about criminal convictions were especially difficult even, though my charges had been dismissed. The question forced me to explain my situation repeatedly. "Have you ever been arrested or convicted of a crime?" the forms would ask. Technically, the answer was yes, I had been arrested and convicted, even though I was later exonerated. Each time I had to check that box and attach an explanation, I relived the trauma of my wrongful conviction. The auto repair shop where I'd worked before my arrest had been sold during my second year on death row. The new owner, Carlos Mendez, was surprisingly understanding when I explained my situation. "I followed your case in the news," he told me during my interview. "I know you were innocent. You're welcome to work here, but I have to be honest. Some customers might recognize you, and that could create problems." He was right to be concerned. My first day back at work was interrupted by 3 customers who recognized me from news coverage. 2 were supportive, expressing their relief that I'd been exonerated and their outrage at what had happened to me. But the 3rd customer was hostile, demanding to know why a convicted murderer was working on his car. I was exonerated. I explained patiently. The charges were dismissed. "I'm completely innocent." "That's what they all say," he replied, taking his business elsewhere. The incident shook me more than I expected. I'd thought that my exoneration would end the judgment and suspicion, but some people seemed determined to see me as guilty regardless of the evidence. The court of public opinion, it seemed, had different standards of proof than actual courts. Dating was even more complicated than employment. How do you explain to someone that you spent 7 years on death row for murders that never actually occurred? How do you build trust with another person when your own experience has taught you that trust can be weaponized against you? My first attempt at dating was a disaster. Maria, a nurse who worked at the hospital where I was receiving therapy, seemed understanding when I explained my history. We went on 3 dates before she abruptly stopped returning my calls. Later, I learned through mutual friends that her family had pressured her to end the relationship, worried about the stigma of dating someone with my background. "You can't let other people's ignorance define your worth." Dr. Warren counseled me during one of our sessions. "Your value as a person isn't determined by what happened to you or how others perceive it." But the rejections were accumulating. Job applications ignored. Dates that never materialized. Social situations where conversations stopped when people recognized me. Each incident reinforced the lesson that exoneration didn't erase the consequences of wrongful conviction. The advocacy work that began to consume more of my time provided a sense of purpose that employment and dating couldn't. Speaking at law schools, consulting with defense attorneys, working with the Innocence Project to help other wrongfully convicted individuals, these activities allowed me to transform my trauma into something constructive. "Your story can prevent other people from suffering what you suffered," explained Jennifer Thompson, a fellow ex-Senary who'd become my mentor in advocacy work. "Every time you speak publicly, every time you share your experience, you're potentially saving someone else's life." The book I began writing about my experience became another form of therapy. Each chapter forced me to confront different aspects of my ordeal: the initial arrest, the trial, the years on death row, the conspiracy that framed me, and the long road to exile. Writing allowed me to process my experiences in a way that talking never could. The most unexpected development was reconnecting with my faith. On death row, I'd turned to religion out of desperation, seeking comfort in the face of imminent execution. But as a free man, I found myself drawn to spirituality for different reasons: gratitude for my survival, hope for the future, and a desire to find meaning in my suffering. "I don't understand why this happened to me," I told Father Rodriguez during one of our conversations at the church I'd started attending, "but I'm beginning to understand that maybe the why isn't as important as the what now." The job application that had sat on my table for 3 weeks was eventually submitted and accepted. Working with my hands again, solving mechanical problems, Building and fixing things, these activities reconnected me with the person I'd been before my arrest. Each day at the shop was a small victory, a step toward reclaiming the life that had been stolen from me. But I was building more than just a new career. I was building a new identity that incorporated my experiences without being defined by them. I was David Martinez, auto mechanic, ex-NRE, advocate, and survivor. The wrongful conviction would always be part of my story, but it wouldn't be the whole story. The Criminal Justice Reform Act of 2025, signed into law by the governor on the second anniversary of my exoneration, bore my name and represented the most comprehensive wrongful conviction prevention legislation in the country. The 47-page bill, officially known as the David Martinez Wrongful Conviction Prevention Act, established new protocols for DNA evidence handling, mandatory recording of all interrogations, and independent oversight of forensic laboratories that could prevent future innocent people from suffering what I had endured. Standing in the governor's office as she signed the bill into law was surreal. 2 years earlier, I'd been 3 weeks away from execution. Now I was watching legislation designed to prevent wrongful convictions become law, with my name permanently attached to it. This bill ensures that what happened to David Martinez will never happen to anyone else in California, Governor Patricia Chen declared. Surrounded by legislators, criminal justice, reform advocates, and survivors of wrongful conviction, we cannot undo the injustice done to Mr. Martinez, but we can honor his suffering by preventing future injustices. The legislation was comprehensive and forward-thinking. It required all police interrogations to be recorded from beginning to end, eliminating the possibility of coerced confessions or fabricated statements. It established independent oversight of forensic laboratories, with regular audits and external reviews of evidence processing. Most importantly, it created a wrongful conviction review board with the authority to investigate cases where innocence claims seemed credible. My role in advocating for the legislation had consumed the better part of 2 years. I'd testified before legislative committees, met with lawmakers, and shared my story countless times to build support for the reforms. Each testimony was emotionally draining, forcing me to relive the worst experiences of my life. But the eventual passage of the legislation made every difficult moment worthwhile. You've turned your trauma into triumph, Senator Maria Rodriguez told me after the bill's final passage. Your suffering now has meaning because it will prevent other people from experiencing the same injustice. The criminal trials of those who'd framed me had concluded with significant convictions. Detective Morrison received 25 years for conspiracy, evidence tampering, and civil rights violations. Vinnie Carlisle was sentenced to life without parole for racketeering and conspiracy to commit murder. Marcus Webb, the identity fraud specialist, received 15 years for his role in the conspiracy. Dr. Foster and Judge Hawkins faced their own consequences. Foster lost her medical license and received 5 years for perjury and evidence tampering. Hawkins was removed from the bench, disbarred, and sentenced to 3 years for accepting bribes and judicial misconduct. Amanda, Michael, and Lisa, 3 people whose fake deaths had nearly cost me my life, received relatively lenient sentences in exchange for their cooperation in prosecuting the real criminals. Amanda served 18 months for insurance fraud and was released to a halfway house, where she continued therapy for domestic violence trauma. Michael served 2 years and was required to attend gambling addiction treatment. Lisa, who'd orchestrated the most sophisticated fraud, served 3 years and was ordered to pay full restitution to the insurance company. My relationship with the 3 victims had evolved into something unexpected, not friendship exactly, but a shared understanding. Born from our interconnected tragedies, we met quarterly for group therapy sessions, processing the complex emotions surrounding our shared experience. I think about the butterfly effect sometimes, Amanda said during one of our sessions, how my decision to escape my abusive marriage set in motion events that nearly got you executed. It's terrifying how connected our lives became without us even knowing each other. The civil lawsuit against the state had finally settled for $37 million, not the $57 million we'd originally sought, but enough to ensure financial security for the rest of my life. More importantly, the settlement included provisions requiring the state to implement additional reforms beyond what the legislation mandated. Money can't give you back those 7 years, my attorney David Chen explained when we reached the settlement, but it can ensure that you never have to worry about financial security again, and it can fund your advocacy work for as long as you want to continue it. I'd used a portion of the settlement to establish the Martinez Foundation for Wrongful Conviction Prevention, a nonprofit organization dedicated to helping other innocent people prove their innocence and advocating for systemic reforms. The foundation funded DNA testing for indigent defendants, provided legal assistance for innocence claims, and supported research into improving forensic science standards. The foundation's first major success came 18 months after its establishment, when we helped exonerate Carlos Rivera, a man who'd spent 12 years in prison for a rape he didn't commit. Watching Carlos walk out of prison as a free man brought back all the emotions of my own exoneration, but with an added dimension: the knowledge that my suffering had contributed to his freedom. You saved my life, Carlos told me at his release, tears streaming down his face. Your foundation gave me hope when I had none left. My personal life had also found new stability. I'd met David Martinez, no relation. Despite sharing a last name at a criminal justice reform conference where we were both speaking, she was a defense attorney who specialized in death penalty cases, and she understood the trauma and complexity of wrongful conviction in ways that civilian friends never could. I fell in love with your resilience before I fell in love with you, she told me on our wedding day. Exactly 3 years after my exoneration, you took the worst thing that could happen to a person and transformed it into something that helps other people. Our wedding was small but meaningful, attended by fellow exonerees, criminal justice advocates, and the family members who'd supported me through my ordeal. Even Amanda, Michael, and Lisa sent congratulatory messages from their respective new lives, expressing their happiness that I'd found love despite everything they'd put me through. The most powerful moment of my new life came when I was invited to speak at the International Conference on Wrongful Convictions in Amsterdam, standing before an audience of judges, prosecutors, defense attorneys, and innocence advocates from around the world. I realized that my story had transcended national boundaries and was contributing to global efforts to prevent wrongful convictions. I stand before you today not as a victim, but as a survivor. I concluded my speech. I cannot change what happened to me, but together, we can ensure it doesn't happen to others. Every reform we implement, every safeguard we establish, every innocent person we help, these are the true measures of justice. The Criminal Justice Reform Act bearing my name would outlive me, protecting future generations of innocent people from the nightmare I'd endured. My foundation would continue its work long after I was gone. The dozens of wrongfully convicted individuals I'd helped exonerate would go on to help others in turn. Sometimes the truth really is stranger than any lie. Sometimes the real criminals are the ones you'd never suspect. But sometimes justice prevails. Truth emerges from the shadows, and suffering is transformed into hope for a better future. I'm David Martinez, and I survived 7 years on death row for murders that never happened. But more importantly, I'm David Martinez, and I've spent the rest of my life ensuring that what happened to me never happens to anyone else.